Hello and welcome to Perspective. I am Jawad Tehami. It was back in 2019 when Pakistan started highlighting the rising trend of Islamophobia across the globe. Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, during his UNGA address, highlighted this issue and tried to bring the international community's conscience into awareness that this rising trend of Islamophobia is happening to be detrimental across the globe. 3 years down the road, Pakistan's relentless efforts came to fruition, and the United Nations General Assembly passed a significant resolution, a landmark resolution, and declaring 15th of March as the day, International Day to combat rising Islamophobia across the globe. A significant diplomatic victory for Pakistani authorities. And to delve deeper into this particular thing, I am going to straight away jump into discussion. I am joined in the studio by Mr. Rizwan Saeed Sheikh, who is Pakistan's permanent representative to Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Thank you very much for being with us in the studio at Perspective today. And I'm also being joined by Mr. Johar Salim, who is Pakistan's ambassador to Italy. Mr. Johar, thank you very much for your time at Perspective today as well. So I'll start the discussion with you, Mr. Rizwan Sheikh. So in terms of a diplomatic victory for Pakistani authorities and victory as far as we call it in securing the rights of the Muslims across the world, how significant and bigger do you think it is?
It is very significant. It is a most significant diplomatic success, certainly, for Pakistan, and it all, as you have mentioned, started with the Prime Minister mentioning it in his UNGA address in 2019. And since I am the ambassador and permanent representative to OIC, it's also worth mentioning that it was definitely first pitched at the Makkah summit again in 2019 at the OIC. Then, of course, this was taken to the UNGA. And again, the sequence in terms of adoption of resolutions has also been that first at the last session of the Council of Foreign Ministers of OIC in Niamey in November 2020, this resolution was adopted for OIC geography only to designate the same 15th of March as the as the Islamophobia Day. And then within that resolution, there was this mandate to take it to the UN General Assembly. And OIC group at the United Nations, under, of course, the leadership of Pakistan, Ambassador Munir Akram, to be more precise, carried this resolution to the UNGA. And it is, at least in terms of diplomatic effort, not just a short time, it's a pretty 2020 effort that we have accomplished this in such a little time of even less than a year and a half. And today we are certainly celebrating Yom Tashakkur to mark its passage.
Mr. Sheikh, I'll come back to you for further discussion. Mr. Johar, as you can see, Pakistan's efforts have come to fruition after 3 years of relentless efforts in order to get this resolution passed. And Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan, a couple of days before, in a public gathering, highlighted this issue and dubbed this thing as a great and significant and landmark achievement. So 3 years of this relentless struggle, what are the major takeaways for Pakistan in terms of its diplomatic victory and in securing the rights for Muslims across the world? And what position do you think Pakistan has gained, specifically when you talk about amongst the Muslim Ummah in particular and among the community of the nations in general?
Pakistan has been spearheading the efforts for a long time to highlight the Islamophobia, the xenophobia, the stereotyping, the stigmatization being faced by the Muslims all around the world. I remember I was in the US in the 80s, 90s, studying there. Then I was there after 9/11, immediate aftermath of 9/11. And I saw and I felt the very strong wave of Islamophobia in the US following 9/11. attacks, of course. Then I've been in Europe now for the last 10 years as ambassador in different countries, including Italy, Germany, and before that, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I've seen the different dimensions of Islamophobia. For instance, in Bosnia and Croatia, it was the Serbs and the other communities which were sort of, in fact, they had been in war with the Muslims because of the very strong feeling of Islamophobia. But in other European countries, in Germany, for instance, there is a very significant Muslim minority, one of the biggest in Europe. And because of that, you feel that in the country. Italy, of course, Italy is it's a home of Christianity in many ways. So I've seen all the different dimensions, and I can tell you it is a real issue for hundreds of millions of Muslims living in the West, first and foremost. And of course, for all the Muslims in the world, the 1.5 billion Muslims. And it was very important that somebody became the champion of the rights of Muslims in this regard, in terms of facing this xenophobia, this Islamophobia. And Pakistan's endeavors over the years have been very well recognized as a leader within the Muslim world in this particular regard. In the last 3 years, in particular, following the Prime Minister's address to the UNGA, and as Rizwan has mentioned, within the OIC. And now we have come to the point where the UNGA has adopted a unanimous resolution designating March 15 as the day to combat Islamophobia. Now that is a big victory.
Okay, your point is well taken. Mr. Sheikh, during this journey down the road, of course, there would be a lot of effort that would have been put by the authorities who are dealing with this on the behalf of the OIC countries, because, of course, there was a consensus among the OIC nations regarding this rising trend of Islamophobia across the world, and there were rising trends and incidents in certain specific regions of the world. There would definitely have been some obstacles down the road. Would you like to share about that?
Certainly, and particularly at the UN General Assembly, because as you have mentioned, within OIC, there is a consensus on Islamophobia being a real and present, clear and present danger to international peace, security and stability. But within the UN corridors, of course, initiating this discussion was not an easy task. And the process, I would say, has only started with the passage of this resolution, because the different dynamics, the different dimensions of this issue will now have to be elaborated. It's the first recognition that it exists, it is there, and it has to be separately categorized to the extent of celebrating and commemorating an International Islamophobia Day every year. The terminology that was there already existing in resolutions with particular reference to freedom of religion was being cited by, for instance, as Ambassador Johar Salim has mentioned, the European states in particular, because normally it is the European Union group at the UNGA that sponsors the freedom of religion resolution. So they were basically advocating and contending that the existing text of the resolution is sufficient, and it includes Muslims in the broad sweep that it has already in that text. But to get it as approved and recognized as a separate category that was reflecting itself and manifesting itself, not only, one must say, in Western Europe, where Ambassador Johar Salim has extensively served and pointed out, but I would say that the most glaring red blinking light on Islamophobia is right in our neighborhood, in India, where over the past 3 years again, we have been seen a havoc that is being played with the right of Muslims. I mean, I think it's either Holi today or the day before yesterday. So it is actually the Holi that was being played with the rights of Muslims in India. And it is now, as I have said, that with the future advancement and the future progress based on this initial recognition, I'm sure that the geographical, historical, contemporary dimensions and facets of this issue would certainly not only be addressed, but come into play in the international discourse.
Of course, Mr. Johar, you already mentioned there is a considerable chunk of Muslim people residing in the European countries. So after passing of this resolution, did it prove to be a sort of a sigh of relief for that chunk of Muslim population across Europe?
Yes. I lost you for a few seconds, so I presume this question is addressed to me.
Yeah, Mr. Johar, I just want to ask you, talking about the general sentiment of the Muslim population that is residing in Europe, you already mentioned there is a considerable chunk of Muslim population residing in European countries. So after passing of this resolution, did it prove to be a sigh of relief for them?
Definitely. I think that the Muslims living in Europe, and there are tens of millions of Muslims living in Europe. In some countries, we have higher concentration than others, like, for instance, Germany and France and the UK, even Italy. This will greatly help. And let me tell you how Islamophobia affects Muslims. Let me give you some clear examples. Some months ago, in fact, it's been more than a year, we've had an issue where there was a case of honor killing within the Pakistani community in Italy. And because of that, the Italian media and within the Italian public opinion, there's a huge hue and cry. And many analysts and a lot of politicians even, and societal leaders, they try to stigmatize or stereotype the Pakistani community in Italy as if the whole community had been involved in that particular crime. So then it became quite a task to combat that feeling, to counter that propaganda, and point out that it was an individual crime. So a whole community could not be stereotyped or stigmatized because. So I think those type of events, now that we have this recognition by the United Nations, it makes our job easier. And that is why the community, Pakistani community here in particular, and the Muslim community in general, in Italy and in Europe, they are very relieved by the recognition at the United Nations level, which is the highest level in the world in many ways, that this Islamophobia exists and it needs to be combated. And also the fact which has been recognized is that Islamophobia is the worst form of xenophobia or stigmatization, negative perception based on misleading misperception. So I think that is very important. But as Rizwan has mentioned, closer to home in India, because you see that is something what is happening in India with the Muslims, particularly within the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, has not been as much recognized in the West as it should have been. We all know that. So this resolution would help us to portray those human rights violations, to portray what is happening in India in a more meaningful way, because with this resolution, it paves the way for the world to be more receptive to such discrimination. And I think that is why it carries a global significance.
Okay, Mr. Johar, as you already mentioned, and also Mr. Rizwan Sheikh has also mentioned, talking specifically about India. Now, Ambassador Munir Akram has said, quote, Indians try to scuttle our resolution at every stage, unquote. So that depicts there is some sort of a malintention as far as the Indian authorities, especially led by Narendra Modi, their Prime Minister, and the fascist BJP regime that is in power since 2014. This is the second term they are having now. And we have seen rising incidents of Islamophobia with not only in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, but also within India against the minorities. There is a hijab ban controversy, and the courts taking the line over that very fascist regime over there. So this happens to be a consistent irritant for Pakistan when it comes to Pakistani authorities doing something regarding the rights of Muslims at the international level. So how to address this and how to make countries like India to be held accountable if such type of incidents are happening over there and continuously they are rising?
I think it's very important that the international community realizes and recognizes what is happening in India. It is very systemic, very deep-rooted, and it has its roots in the rise of a party, a political party, which was founded in some sort of semi-militarism. We all know that BJP is basically an offshoot of RSS, and the ideology of RSS is pretty well known. In fact, in the West, we have been emphasizing this point that RSS had a fascist ideology, and BJP has built its entire political capital, and Modi has built his entire political career on fomenting the feeling of Islamophobia in India, starting from the Babri Mosque issue to the Gujarat massacre and all the events that happened in between. And we see that even now in the biggest Indian state, Uttar Pradesh, UP that is. We see what is happening, what type of leadership they have put forward there. But I think internationally, unfortunately, because of India's size, because of their economy, because of their clout, it was a little difficult for us especially to convey to the West that they need to raise their voices. But with the UNGA clearly defining Islamophobia and clearly defining it as a threat to international order, I think the task becomes a little bit easier, because what is happening in India could be defined in terms of xenophobia or Islamophobia or sort of, basically massive human rights directed against one particular community, whether it's a religious community, whether it's you could call it a social community, a cultural community. In fact, it is all of those. So I think in that way, it is very important. And now it is upon us to ensure that we translate the passing of this resolution into action in terms of better
it's implementation, Mr. Johar. It's in terms of its implementation. That is exactly the point which Prime Minister Imran Khan has alluded to after the passing of this resolution, that the major challenge now is to implement this resolution. So, Mr. Rizwan Sheikh, when we talk about the implementation, could there be any possibility that a certain mechanism could be chalked out? As we know, that Security Council happens to be the only organ, the resolutions of which are passed, and they are only having the binding effect on the countries. So when it comes to the resolutions which are passed by the UNGA, so is there any possibility a mechanism could be chalked out for its implementation, and do they have any binding effect on the countries?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, that it's only the start of a process. This is a very important milestone, but when we look back, inshallah, a few years down the line, it would constitute a genesis, and we would be able to maybe draw some satisfaction that this process was initiated in 2022. There is a lot to be done, as you have mentioned, that in implementation lies the significance in terms of not only recognizing this concept in theory, but taking certain steps, concerted action on the part of international community to, now that they have recognized this as a problem and would be spending a day commemorating it and sort of marking it, it is significant now to and important now to think of its different dimensions, its different manifestations, geographical, historical, because it all started not just now, but it has been there. And perhaps what needs to be looked into is the fact that the already existing international covenants, for instance, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Covenant on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which were evolved in and finalized in late 60s, mainly to combat racism in South Africa and other parts of the world, do not cover Islamophobia as such. They are not broad enough and not specific enough to cover the threat that Islamophobia poses to international peace, security and stability. And as we have discussed, and both myself and Ambassador Salim have pointed out, that it is now not limited to a particular part of the world or the Western world, so as to say. It is now more significantly and more sort of pronouncedly reflecting and manifesting itself right in our neighborhood. So certainly Pakistan has all the reasons now to not only draw satisfaction from what has already been accomplished, but go into the technicalities of it, the human rights significance of this issue, because Islamophobia is a fact that affects the entire body of human rights of Muslims anywhere in the world. I mean, if it is impacting Muslims in one part of the world, it is destroying, it is tarnishing Muslim identity even in other parts of the world. So that is where perhaps the action in future lies, and as the Prime Minister has rightly pointed out, that implementation will have to be embarked upon without spending much time or without allowing much time to lapse, because the momentum is there in the General Assembly, and the concept has been recognized in the General Assembly by the entire UN membership. So there is a rationale, there is a momentum that can be carried to other relevant parts of the UN system, be it the UN Security Council, be it the UN Human Rights Council, and other relevant bodies which deal with these issues generally or specifically in terms of different facets.
Okay, your point is well taken. Mr. Johar, I'll try to go back a little down in the history when we, regarding the significance of the date to declare 15th of March as the day, International Day to Combat Islamophobia. On this day, the white supremacists in New Zealand massacred the worshippers in 2 mosques, and the response by the New Zealand authorities at that time was phenomenal, and they expressed wholehearted solidarity with the Muslims living over there. But similarly, we saw a statement coming by President Vladimir Putin about hate speech, and it was also reciprocated warmly by Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan. And during his recent Russia tour, both the leaders discussed Islamophobia also. So when we talk about countries which don't have a larger chunk of population that happens to be Muslim, but on the contrary, when we talk about India, which has a considerable and a huge chunk of Muslim population, so we see a drastic contrast between the policies of such countries towards their Muslims.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I would just go back a little to just add to what Rizwan had said, and I think he had rightly pointed it out. First of all, these resolutions in the UNGA, and even certain resolutions within the UNSC, United Nations Security Council, they could be non-binding as well. There's only certain chapters under which you could have binding resolutions in the UNSC. So when we use the word implementation, we have to be very careful, because there's no mechanism as such to have such resolutions implemented. But the important thing here is that in the world today, what we see is a battle of narratives. And in that battle of narratives, the battle of hearts and minds, that is where the importance of such resolutions, especially when they are passed unanimously, against the opposition of India and certain European countries as well. So that is where the importance lies. Now, the other point that you've mentioned in terms of some countries having significant Muslim population and they're behaving differently compared to countries with less significant Muslim population. I would like to first point out that Russia and India, they both have significant Muslim population. Russia also has a significant Muslim population. It even had a bigger Muslim population when it was Soviet Union. But of course, the treatment of Muslim minorities is different in different countries. The worst scenario that we see, obviously, is in India. And there are many historical reasons for that, as we have mentioned. We have mentioned some of those. But I think the primary reason is not just history, but also the fact that the ruling, not just the ruling political party, the ruling elite in India has built its political capital, its political base, its political power on the plank of Islamophobia. So I think that really changes the ballgame in India as compared to other countries. Having said that, Islamophobia is a global issue. Muslims living in Europe face very many different aspects of it. Muslims living in North America and in other parts of the world, they face it as well. And those are important too. And having such recognition, like this is a unique recognition, because there are certain countries who are calling upon the fact that there should not be a specific resolution against Islamophobia, rather a generic resolution against phobia against all religions. But in the end, we were able to convince.
Mr. Johar, exactly that is the point. There were certain countries which were opposing this passing of this resolution, including India, which has been already very clearly mentioned by Ambassador Munir Akram himself. Then European Union also opposed, and the leading country in the European Union, France, happened to be the one that didn't want this one to happen, as it has passed the way it has. But the situation, when we talk about France in particular over the last couple of years, it has deteriorated in terms of the rights of the Muslims over there. There have been discrimination against Muslim students and the students applying with Muslim names or the surnames. And then there are certain reports highlighting this grim fact that is happening. Then the issuing of blasphemous caricatures. And then we talk about President Macron's statements, which were inflammatory in themselves. And then there was a hijab ban. Then there was an anti-radicalism act that was passed. So there is a considerable chunk of Muslim population in France. Don't you think that the French authorities realize the severity and the sensitivity of the matter?
Well, it's a sensitive topic, of course, and I hope, and there are certain indications that they do recognize the fact that they have a significant Muslim population in France. In fact, in some ways, in terms of the percentage of population, probably the biggest within the European Union. So naturally, but I think the French traditions are very different to some of the European countries. And that is why we see certain aspects of of their defining their terms of how to deal with Islamophobia as compared to certain other countries. For instance, I was in Germany. I remember when Chancellor Angela Merkel, she had to visit India, and we invited her attention, to the facts in terms of what was happening in the illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, the massive human rights violations, the deprivation, the illegal actions being taken place there. And I must say that they listened to the extent that Chancellor Merkel, when she visited India, she made a statement about that. And that was a big surprise for India. So the point is that the European leaderships, they do listen. But it's very important for our diplomacy to to invite their attention in a way that keeping in view the way the countries work. These are democratic countries. These are countries where the parliaments have a certain influence, of course, great influence, but also the civil society, the intelligentsia, the media. So you have to work on all these organs of the state to have your perspective listened to and recognized. And I think that would be important in France as much as it is important in Germany and other countries. So I'm sure the Muslim countries, embassies there, and the Muslim countries in their interaction with France are pressing this point.
I'll go to Mr. Rizwan Sheikh. Mr. Sheikh, how do you see France's role when it came to passing of this specific resolution, given the circumstances in France? And after the passing of this resolution, the acts which have already been passed in France, do you think there could be any countering force in this resolution to those acts, such as Anti-Radicalism Act and hijab ban in France?
Well, as Ambassador Jawhar Salim has mentioned, that France, in terms of its tradition, is slightly different from the rest of the Europe. And the fact that now this resolution has been passed unanimously at the General Assembly, I think it would have a salutary effect because of course the European Union and of course by extension France has joined this consensus. So the necessity to have an Islamophobia day around the world is recognized by everybody, including of course the French diplomacy and French leadership. So this resolution should have a salutary effect there. And in terms of now implementation, while we have discussed that there is the opportunity to expand the aperture, broaden the aperture to different facets of Islamophobia, there are also existing mechanisms that could be utilized. For instance, for the past 10 years now, it is into its 11th year, almost 11 years, there has been the Human Rights Council Resolution 1618, which is again a consensual resolution adopted by the Council, which is targeting or which is trying to cope with religious intolerance and incitement to violence, incitement to hatred based on religious grounds. This resolution, again, it is a Human Rights Council resolution, and a variant of this resolution is then transposed to the third committee at the General Assembly and again passed there as well. But since we are discussing implementation, let me mention for the benefit of your audience, and in today's world, of course, they can Google it and go for the details. This resolution is a resolution both at the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, which has an implementation process attached to it. There is a process called the Istanbul process. During my previous stay, when I was on deputation to the OIC General Secretariat under the Turkish Secretary General Akmaluddin Ehsanoglu, we were able to get this resolution adopted, and not this resolution adopted, institute a process for its implementation. And there are at the heart of this resolution, or in the operative part of this resolution, 8 points of the Secretary General of OIC, in which, for instance, for the interest and the focused interest, I am sure that your viewers would have, is the point number 6 or point number F, which calls for the criminalization, a movement toward criminalization of any derogation of veneered personalities, religious personalities. So that is something which is already there, could be utilized and even build on now that we have recognized Islamophobia as a threat.
Exactly, your point is well taken. Mr. Jawhar, when we talk about Prime Minister Imran Khan's statement, he vocally had been and categorically been saying that terrorism can't be linked with any religion whatsoever, and specifically after 9/11, Muslims were targeted specifically, and the role of the Muslim leaders was not that phenomenal at that time because they went on the back foot. At the same time, this relentless campaign on the part of the Western media was unleashed, and the Muslims across the globe were targeted. How do you think, specifically after passing of this resolution now in this age of social media, how can this perception against the Muslims, especially in the Western countries, could be countered, and how other media, such as the broadcast media or the print media, could be used to change the mindset?
Exactly. Like I said, eventually, within the global polity, many things are linked to the battle of narratives um, in the world today that we live. Because you see the governments, or in fact, in terms of international law, you see the countries could just take whatever stance they want to, and there's nothing much which could be done, short of some very, very stringent actions by the United Nations Security Council, which are rare, few and far between. So it becomes even more important that the peoples realize themselves, particularly in the Western democracies, that's how things work. And I remember the time, like you have mentioned, like when the Muslims all over the world faced the full brunt, the full thrust of that, the hatred, the stigmatization, the xenophobia after 9/11. And it was very unfortunate because, in actual fact, Muslims themselves had been the biggest victims of terrorism. Pakistan, for instance, we had been at the vanguard of the fight against terrorism, and we suffered huge losses, more than 100,000 killed and $150 billion of economic losses, and the instability which had been created in the country since. Probably in many ways, it prevented us from developing the way we should have, like other countries in our region did, to a certain extent. They benefited from not having to face this problem. So I think that was very unfortunate. On the other one hand, we were facing that. And on the other hand, we were being blamed for terrorism while being a victim of that. So over the years, one of the thrusts of our diplomacy has been to clarify or to clear those misperceptions, to put across a balanced perspective of what was going on in the world. And the milestones, like Rizwan has mentioned, the milestones like this particular resolution, they can create a big impact. And that is why they're so important. For the last 3 or 4 years, and particularly since that terrorist incident in New Zealand, and then, of course, there was many other incidents all around the world against the Muslims, terrorist incidents against the Muslims. And that has, in some ways, of course, the Muslims had to face it. But at the same time, it did create an acceptability of the fact that Muslims were not the perpetrators, but rather victims. And that is why it became so important. And I can tell you that. I think probably like 10 or 15 years in the past, such a resolution would not have passed unanimously because the ambience was not right. Of course, the diplomatic efforts have significantly increased in the last 3 years, but still, it's very important that the receptivity is there.
Diplomatic efforts have been increased. Of course, the media could be utilized. A lot of Muslim countries can collaborate on the media front in order to change the mindset and the perception, specifically in the Western world. When we talk about the role of Muslim scholars, the academicians and the intelligentsia and the people who are associated with with literature, don't you think they couldn't play that role in order to counter that very relentless campaign by the Western media in order to portray the true image of Islam that professes brotherhood, tolerance, and it gives you a social and justice system as well, and it gives you the platform for the reflection on bigger issues of life?
Well, that's a very good point. I think that was one of the big problems. That was one of the big shortcomings, because look, how many Muslims have won the Nobel Prize thus far? Compare that to the Jewish who have won Nobel Prize, or adherents of other faiths like Christians. Then again, how many international scholars of the stature of a global stature are Muslims? How many leading professors in the top universities of the world are Muslim? So if you look at all that, it's rather a very insignificant percentage, particularly when we compare to the percentage of Muslims population in the world. So that was a huge shortcoming. Um, that that yes, that prevented. And in the media again, I think media is so important in today's world. And unfortunately, in the international media, we had no presence at all, other than a channel or two. So because of that, it was an uphill task. And it's very important that the Muslim scholars, first of all, they have to build that the cloud within the intelligentsia, within the academia, within the media as well. And then, of course, they have to be more coherent and sort of, more cogent in terms of um, the ideas and thoughts we convey. So I think definitely that is there because it has to be a wholesome effort. It cannot just be a political effort because that wouldn't work. It's a multi-dimensional issue being faced by the Muslims, and it needs a multi-dimensional approach. So it's not just the governments which can play a part. This part has to be played by the intelligentsia, by the academia, by even the Muslim artists, I would say, the Muslim playwrights. It has to be a multidisciplinary
Your point is well taken,
endeavor.
Mr. Johar.
Definitely.
Mr. Rizwan Sheikh, do you agree with Mr. Johar? It has to be a wholesome effort. It doesn't only require the political will. The role of religious scholars, the intelligentsia, the academicians, the educationists, even the artists happen to be very crucial at the same time.
Certainly, couldn't agree more. It is not, now that the governments have played their part in initiating a process, it should now proliferate into other circles, particularly of the Muslim world, academia, intelligentsia, artists, as Ambassador Johar Salim has pointed out, even religious scholars. The clergy in the Muslim world, they have to take this effort up in a more constructive fashion, because in today's world of social media and connectivity and global village, as we call it, the narrative spreads, and it is because of this social media utilization and use, for instance, that in December, if you recall, there was enough pressure mobilized that the US Congress took notice of it, this particular aspect, and recognized Islamophobia. And again, to come back to our own region, this pressure should also be exercised on India and the Indian government, the current government of India, because while they proclaim themselves as the world's largest democracy, if you look at this particular aspect and others, there are too many, they would come across and as the world's largest hypocrisy, because there is a lot which is being said and not practiced. So we, with the use of social media by different segments of society in the Muslim world, in the OIC member states, I would say, have to take this further, and the governments and the private people, the civil society, have to move in concert on this.
Okay, Mr. Sheikh, your point is well taken. Unfortunately, we are short of time. So very briefly, we are going to have the OIC moot in a couple of days from now. Of course, Pakistan's standing has been upgraded after the passing of this resolution on behalf of the OIC countries. Now, when this time around the foreign ministers of all OIC countries sit, what is going to be their strategy in future regarding this issue?
Certainly, well, OIC has had a regular passage of resolution in Islamophobia over the past more than a decade. Now that we are having this foreign ministers conference in Islamabad on the heels of this monumental passage of a resolution at the General Assembly, it can definitely be expected that it would be one of the central focuses of the forthcoming Council of Foreign Ministers, and they would be able to devise a common not only position on this particular issue, but evolve a common strategy to take it further with the OIC or under the OIC umbrella.
Mr. Johar, how do you see when this time around foreign ministers of OIC countries are going to sit together? First of all, what are they going to feel about after passing of this resolution, and what could be the future strategy regarding this matter in future?
I think it's a very important event that is taking place, and it's really opportune that it takes place in the wake of the passage of this resolution. So first of all, I think the Muslim, the representatives from all the Muslim countries, they would express a great deal of satisfaction. Of course, you take pride in what you have accomplished. But like Rizwan said, this is just, in some ways, it's a starting point again. It brings us to, let's say, a higher stage of what we are trying to endeavor. But still, it's just a milestone, and there's a lot more work to be done. And I think so many heads from so many important Muslim countries, they would brainstorm on how to go about it, like in terms of ways and means to highlight this further, and ways and means to prevent Islamophobia in practice. So I think that this meeting would provide a great opportunity for the Muslim world, first of all, to celebrate
of the foreign ministers of OIC countries, Mr. Johar Salim, Pakistan's ambassador to Italy, and Mr. Rizwan Saeed Sheikh, Pakistan's permanent representative to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. Thank you very much for your time, both of you gentlemen, for being at Perspective. Islamophobia is real. That is what Ambassador Munir Akram said after the passing of this resolution, a landmark resolution as dubbed by Prime Minister Imran Khan. As a lot of things are needed to be done. It is not about only the political will, it's all about the intelligentsia, the academicians, the educationists, even the artists, and the media have to play the role in order to change the mindset where there are rising incidents of Islamophobia. It is just a precursor to a better future for the Muslims across the globe. With this, we come to the end of today's discussion. Until the next show, it's goodbye.